Welcome once again to the chat room. Nice to have your company. This I like to call the fastest 28 minutes on television, because what we do is we grab a big idea and we explore it, skate all over it for 28 minutes and unpack it, explain what it means. Actually, I don't do that. The Dean of Sydney does that. Phillip, Jensen. Phillip, g'day.
Hello, Kel, but getting the right question is more important than the answer.
I'm just glad mine's the question side and yours is the answer side. We're going to talk about what's acceptable and unacceptable and why. We've talked about it before, right and wrong in our society, because we have debates about that. And we have huge debates in the media about, what's the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do. And the big word we're going to have a look at today is the word utilitarianism. Don't reach for the remote and switch it all off. It's just a $25 word saying we're going to decide what's acceptable and what's not on the basis of what works for most people. And it's a dangerous idea in some ways. Now, you've been getting onto this because you've been reading about Bertrand Russell recently, the famous philosopher.
Yeah. Yes. It's outcomes. It works. That's what Bertrand Russell was for, as much as you can work out what Bertrand Russell... the trouble with Bertrand Russell is that he lived 98 years and he kept writing the whole time.
Yes.
So it's voluminous what he did or didn't believe at any point. But basically the only way he could work out right and wrong was in terms of outcomes, results.
Yes.
And attached to it was a view of creating the scientific society.
You calculate exactly what's going to...
That's right. And you can experiment and see results. And as a result of good results, then you do more of that.
Yes.
And bad results, therefore you do bad. And so in the 1920s, he was captivated by behaviourist psychology, because they experimented and they showed you how to raise children the right way.
And it was scientific.
Absolutely scientific. It was results. But of
Yes.
course, behaviourism has been shot since then.
Yes.
And anyway, his own children didn't turn out too well from the experiment, and the very activity of experimenting on your children is going to distort how you raise them.
Pretty grubby idea in some ways, isn't it?
Yes, he wasn't as bad as the great behaviourist Skinner, because he literally put his daughter in a Skinner box, like they have Skinner boxes where you train rats and animals and pigeons. Well, he put his daughter into a Skinner box to raise her for some length of time.
Some people are going to say, look, aren't outcomes a good way to decide how to behave and how not to behave? If you can work out what outcomes will be best for society, what outcomes will produce the best result for most people, that's got to be the right thing to do.
In lots of issues it is right. You'll get better outcomes from building your house if you employ an architect and an engineer to calculate what it is. And so we work on outcomes in lots of areas of life, and it's just sheer sensible.
But does it work when you're looking at morality? Well, I was going to say morality, and then I was going to say ethics. So let me ask you first, are morality and ethics the same thing?
I don't think they are, but you're the wordsmith, so you've got to find that out. I mean, ethics is a Greek word and morality is a Latin word. Ethics comes from the concept of culture, behaviour, system, whereas morality has more a feel, to me anyway, of right and wrong. So I wouldn't say they're exactly the same, although people have replaced morality. They don't like morality. That's an unpopular word these days.
Yes, it is, isn't it? Yeah.
Because it's black and white, right and wrong.
Yes.
Whereas ethics is how the system works, how we...
Community standards.
Community standards.
You want to complain against a television program, it violates community standards.
And of course, if you show enough of that, then community standards drop and then it becomes acceptable.
I think what we need to talk about on that basis, I'll pursue the verbal thing later, is morality. Because we want to talk about what's good and what's bad.
Yes.
So why don't outcomes tell us what is good and bad outcomes tell us what is bad morally?
Because morality is not about outcomes, it's about rights and wrongs.
Right.
And right or wrong is intrinsic in the action itself.
Right.
In general, wrong will have bad outcomes. In general, right will have good outcomes, but not necessarily. So telling the truth might actually cost me a lot. And so how do you judge outcomes? If it's judged in terms of my happiness, well, sometimes me telling the truth will create considerable unhappiness. You say to me, do I like your tie? And I say, no, it's actually pretty hideous. In one sense, it can have good outcomes because you take it off and stop wearing such a dreadful tie, and so no one else is offended and you're not thought to be a complete twit. Another case, though, it can be it breaks our relationships, breaks our friendships.
Yes.
And my wife personally chose that, so I'm now offside with your wife, with you, with
never have dinner together
never
again.
have dinner again. So we destroy relationship over the taste of a tie. Now, telling the truth can cost you a lot, but yet it's still the right thing to do, irrespective whether it costs you a lot.
And so can sometimes be the difference between short-term and long-term outcomes in that sense.
Yes.
In the short term, a bit of bad behaviour, morally bad behaviour, can work out. I rob a bank, I'm suddenly rich.
Yes.
I get caught, I'm suddenly in jail.
Yes.
Short-term, long-term outcomes.
That's right. And
So,
it's whose happiness and outcomes.
yes.
Because one person's very much happier, but mind you, all the people who had their money in the bank are unhappy.
Yes.
So it's who's happy, but it is short-term and long-term. See, it's the problem of educational experiments. One of the great problems with experimenting on education is that a key to education is enthusiasm. And whenever there's an educational experiment, the teacher gets enthusiastic.
Right.
So in the short term, there'll always be good results on educational experiments.
Just because the teacher's really keen and teaching
Yes.
enthusiastically.
But the next generation of teachers who try and use the same method without the enthusiasm,
Yes, it doesn't work anymore.
doesn't work.
Okay. When these people who are promoting making moral decisions on the basis of outcome, they talk about happiness. Happiness is the great measure.
Yes.
It is the standard.
Yeah, that's right.
We're going to do what's going to make most people most happy. Now, what's wrong with that as a standard for making moral judgments?
Who made up happiness as the standard? I mean, that is, don't get me wrong, I'm always happy to be happy. But happiness is not the ultimate good, or even if it is, how do you know it is? Where does that come from? It's a prejudice. It's something that we've already decided without any rational explanation as to why happiness should be.
Randomly chosen, in a sense.
That's right. You could have chosen something else. Second is, how do you calculate happiness? So, in the ancient world, the people who pursued happiness, the Epicureans, they found out that so much happiness was good, but a little bit more made you unhappy. So, drinking enough to get merry was good, but drinking too much gave you a headache the next day.
So how do you know where to draw the line in happiness? Yeah.
And so they actually work for ataraxia in the end, for living the untroubled life.
Right.
You minimise the happiness so that you minimise the pain of the unhappiness.
Right.
And they spent lots of time trying to work out where that exact mean is, which is a pretty unhappy way to spend your life, actually, to always be calculating one more drink will do me, but two won't.
And if I do this, the family will be a little bit happier.
Yes.
But if I do more, the family will be a little
That's
unhappier.
right. And then how do you weigh happiness? See, I am ecstatically happy. You are mildly unhappy. Does that mean overall happiness is up? So I torture you, and I'm ecstatically happy. You are mildly unhappy. That's still therefore worthwhile. We've got positive outcome.
But you've been torturing people for years, so you're now only mildly happy, and I'm in great pain, so I'm very unhappy, so you have to stop.
We'll have to stop then, yes, that's right. But then my happiness is being robbed, isn't it? And,
It is an impossible calculation.
Oh, it's a stupid idea,
Yes.
frankly.
I mean, can I play the word watcher for a minute?
Yeah.
The word happiness comes from the idea of just what happens.
Happiness.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
So our happiness means our circumstances are okay.
Yes.
But you can't control circumstances, and a lot better than happiness sometimes is contentedness regardless of the circumstances.
Yes, that's right.
So-
Well, Russell wrote a book on the conquest of happiness,
Right,
but he did it at a time when he was in the depth of depression.
yes.
His marriage was falling apart, his business, everything was going wrong in his life, and so he wrote a book on how he'd conquered happiness and how. But it's a silly idea, really.
But this is still an idea dominating our society. It seems to dominate governments.
Yes.
It seems to dominate a lot of community decisions. If we think this is going to make people happy, we're going to focus entirely on outcomes, and if it sort of works in that sense, that's what we'll do.
Yes, although we've done the flip side now. It's not so much promoting happiness as minimising harm.
Right.
And so a lot of government policy decisions now on harm minimisation.
So we worked out we can't maximise everyone's happiness. So we'll do as little hurt as possible.
Yes.
We'll hurt as few people as possible.
That's right. You walk across the world in such a way that you leave no footprints.
Right. That seems like a very powerful and dramatic thing to do.
Yes. So it's better that you're never there, actually. That's the kind of ideal.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for us outsiders to understand why that doesn't just disable governments at all, completely. But that's what they're trying to do these days.
Yes. And that's because we've given up any morality.
Okay, so instead of focusing on outcomes, we should in reality be looking at something other than outcomes.
Yes. Yes. I mean, outcomes are good on certain areas, but you need underlining the outcomes, what is right and what is wrong. And the one cover-all word, happiness, doesn't do it.
Yeah.
Or harm minimisation, give you two big words, doesn't do it.
In fact, I assume it to be open to abuse, because if you worked out, this will minimise the harm for most people, a few people, boy, they're going to suffer, but we're going to do it anyway and let them suffer because it minimises the harm for most people.
It's called the Gulag Archipelago. The Russians, throughout the Cold War, kept sending people to Siberia in the salt mines because they had anti-Soviet thoughts. And so these few people, thousands, actually millions, who would suffer terrible deprivation and death in the salt mines were sacrificed for the good of the total. And so the maximisation of happiness in the Russian state and the USSR was upheld as the basis upon which innocent men and women, because they had done no crime, they just had anti-Soviet thoughts, were put into torture. So utilitarianism can be a powerfully wicked form of social engineering.
If we get into a debate about morality with people at work or wherever, how do we answer it when they say, well, just look at the outcomes. If the outcomes are okay, it's got to be okay. How do we respond to those people?
There are those areas of life where that's true.
Right.
It's just when you move across to morality of what's right and wrong that it's not true. And even those areas of life, you have to have an underlying ethics. So building
underlying
the bridge,
morality.
Morality, yes, thank you. Building the bridge here might be better than building the bridge there because there's better outcomes. But underlying it is the whole question of, should humans build bridges?
Right.
On what basis do we change the natural...
So basic morality says there are X things you can do and there are X things you can't do, regardless of what their outcomes are.
Yes, that's right. That's just the rights and wrongs of life that you need to. And the ecological debate keeps slipping into that right and wrong, this great moral fervour amongst the ecologists. As well as the practical sciences, this is the outcomes. And they keep slipping from one to the other, you'll notice.
And it gets muddled and confused for that reason.
Because outcomes themselves are not sufficient to demand that we all change the way we live.
Well, in fact, let me go a bit further. Is it the case that those people who did focus for their moral, ethical thinking on outcomes failed? That as a moral process fails? I mean, if you look, you've been reading Bertrand Russell's biography. I mean, if you look at his life, is there evidence that it just doesn't work if you focus on outcomes?
Well, if you focus on him, it certainly doesn't. I mean, he was just plainly awful. He was a nasty man whose life fell apart. I mean, he saw enormous input. He wrote a book on morals and marriage. He wrote books on love. But he was incapable of doing it. And he just had one series of relationships after another in which he used other people. He used women. He abused them. He put 2 of them in psychiatric care.
That's pretty heavy.
He tried to murder twice, and he just failed through his incompetence. That's all. It was not because he changed his mind or something.
So this benign white-haired old man who was this elder statesman and great thinker was this?
Yes. He's famous for having gone in the First World War as a pacifist into jail. But he wasn't a pacifist. He was enamoured with German and Russian culture, and he just didn't like the First World War. But he believed in colonial wars because people of different race were civilised like the Europeans. He just was opposed to Europeans fighting each other, but to oppress the Indians or the Africans, well, that's perfectly appropriate. Right. He believed and practiced eugenics. The idea that he said people shouldn't breed really unless they are the right kind of people.
Yeah, so they'd come up to me and say, I'm sorry, you're really ugly, you can't breed, and they look at you and say, you're very handsome, you can breed.
Yes, or they'd say, it's a great shame your parents did breed.
One thing about it, yes.
And so, but eugenics lay behind Adolf Hitler and his whole hatred of the Jews.
And wanting Nordic, blue-eyed, blonde-haired Germans, yes.
So, what I find fascinating and annoying is Bertrand Russell, because he was a very great logician and mathematician, and because he was an atheist who fiercely wrote against Christianity, even there's a book published called Why I'm Not a Christian, has been lauded and upheld as the great moral thinker of the 20th century, great philosopher. But actually, he was awful.
He was an intellectual. That was the place that he held in society, public intellectual. But he's not the only intellectual. And most intellectuals seem to be advocating this just focus on the outcomes point of view, don't they?
Yes.
So the intellectuals, are they for us or against us?
Well, the big public ones have been, because they're self-appointed and they appoint each other. And the one thing you're not allowed to be is a real believer in God. And when you do become a believer in God, you get dropped out of the club.
Right.
So,
or told you're senile or something.
C.M. Joad was one of them, and he became a Christian in his senior years. Well, suddenly he was over the hill, and not what. They're doing the same to Anthony Flew at the moment, because Anthony Flew's been a great atheist philosopher for most of his life, and now has come to accept at least the existence of the supernatural, if not the existence of God by name. There's a new book out. I haven't read where he's up to now, but he's now. Of course, he's gone senile.
Yes. So the intellectual community controls the intellectual output of our society.
Yes.
Censors, self-censors.
Who is the intellectual?
Yes.
Who publishes? They control the publishing. They control who's... And so there's this self-confirming view that all intelligent people reject God. And that's part of why utilitarianism is chosen. That is, if you get rid of God, what are we going to do about morals? As soon as you start saying, well, this is right and that is wrong, someone can reasonably ask, well, how do you know? And who tells us that it's right and wrong? And on what basis do you know that? And so we can't say that. So then we drop down to utilitarianism. What is the outcome? What's the best results? But utilitarianism doesn't work. And we know it doesn't work. But that's the only place they've got to go.
There are going to be some people watching us now who are going to say, but this is just ideas. This is just in the realm of ideas. Look, what I do is I'm a cabinet maker, I'm a bricklayer, I sell used cars, and I do practical stuff. And ideas don't matter all that much. But ideas do have consequences, don't they?
Oh, huge consequences. I mean, the sexual revolution and reorganisation of our family life has come out of exactly these ideas. See, the 1920s, Bertrand Russell's set of people, but it was earlier than that, it was the Bloomsbury set at the beginning of the century. They pushed and promoted that we should get rid of marriage as we know it, that the polygamy should be allowed, free sexual expression amongst anybody should be allowed, that it just goes on and on. The list of things that actually came into effect in the late 20th century. And so now we have dysfunctional families. Now we have deserted children. Now we have the large number of children being raised by single parents. Now a whole change of society, none of which has been demonstrated to be of good outcome.
So there's a trickle-down effect, that it's what starts off just a bunch of self-serving intellectuals talking about, trickles down until it bursts into the popular culture and changes the way people behave.
That's right. And it's like, say, pornography. You fight against censorship, and so you open the doors up to pornography, and then 40 years later, yes, people are saying pornography is dreadful, it's everywhere. But you can't actually get the cork back in the bottle anymore.
Yes.
It's out there now. And people's values have so been changed by watching pornography that they don't always see that it is as dreadful as it is. And so you can't scientifically experiment on society. You can't have a control group. In South Australia, we're going to allow pornography. In Victoria, we're not going to, and let's see what the results will be.
Right.
Because it goes across the border. And over 30, 40 years, the whole nature of people's views are changed by what they see. And so you don't know...
And suddenly the so-called community standards we were talking about earlier are all over the place.
They've changed. Yeah. The classic is Richard Neville, who was one of the key proponents of getting rid of censorship with the Oz magazine fights, etc., and was tried at the Old Bailey, etc., to break the censorship. In the 1990s, he saw a movie, the cook, the doctor, the cook, the whatever it is.
Yes.
And he was horrified. He said, we didn't fight that battle in order to have this rubbish.
But if you fight that battle that way, this is the rubbish you end up with.
Yeah, don't it? See, some time ago, we wrote this little book called Pure Sex, Tony Payne and I did, in which it talks about the the struggle of the sexual revolution. And it talks about the people behind the sexual revolution, because although it came in the 1960s when there was a large number of young adults all at the same time, it really was driven from the beginning of the 20th century through by Margaret Mead, by Bertrand Russell, by Alfred Kinsey, the whole string of people who were these intellectuals, all of whom themselves were immoral, all of whom themselves wanted sexual immorality, and used utilitarianism to kind of put a respectable face.
They used their own
God.
intellectual capacity to put a respectable face on things.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
And the arguments they used actually don't hold water.
Right.
And the evidence is all against them. But they're still today lauded as the great ones.
In fact, you've written a book about the wider range of ideas and the wider range of impact they've had on our world.
Yes, this one, the prodigal world. You see, it's the world that, full of riches, has run away and just wasted them. So
Once we decide God is not there, everything else we decide starts to fall apart.
Yes, and utilitarianism is the kind of respectable face of godlessness.
Right.
It gives you an intellectual respectability that I've got a moral system that is going to work, but it actually doesn't.
And if ever we write a letter to the newspaper saying, without God there's no moral standard, people are outraged and letters flood in saying this is stupid.
Yes.
Of course we can have moral standards without God.
Yes.
And it's based on exactly this sort of thinking.
That's right. And they are carrying those bits of Christianity in.
They're importing those bits of Christianity.
That's right.
Okay.
And that's what Mr. Nietzsche, the German philosopher, was so against. He wasn't so much against Christians as he was against the people who would give up Christianity but hang on to the Christian morals.
Right.
Because it was totally irrational.
And he wanted to get rid of Christian morals as well as
He
Christianity.
said, if you're going to God is dead, then do what you like.
Some time ago there was a bloke who called this a cut flower civilization, that wanted to cut the flowers off at the root but still wanted them to grow.
Yes.
So we still want relationships and we still want community and these things that grow out of Christianity, although people deny they do these days. We want those.
Yes.
We want to get rid of what they grow out on,
That's
with
right.
Christianity. But you do that and the flowers die.
The flowers die. It doesn't happen. Now, you can see it in people like Paul Johnson wrote this book called The Intellectuals 20 years ago, I think, in the 1980s, in which he just goes through some of these famous and great people who were the intellectuals like Rousseau and like Marx and Tolstoy and Brecht and Sartre and the rest. And he actually points out that really it was their life choices that they were rationalising and then putting across us. Marx knew almost nothing about the working class. The only working class person he ever had anything to do with was his maid, whom he got pregnant and refused to acknowledge the child. And once you actually look into the personal lives of these people, you start to see that they're using their cleverness as a mask for their immoral godlessness.
So in the end, at the risk of sounding incredibly old-fashioned and being mocked by all the intellectuals, in the end, it comes down to sin.
Yes. Ultimately, that's where it does come down to. That without God, you have to then make up a world. And if you're half intelligent, you'll do it rationally. But
And
there
you'll
is
do
no
it
rationality.
persuasively.
Oh,
Even
very
if there are holes
persuasive.
in it, it will sound
It
persuasive.
sounds very persuasive. And a man who's like Bertrand Russell, who's a professional logician, he can make it sound very persuasive, but in fact, it's rubbishy.
Some people watching us now are going to say, look, I'm a Christian. The one thing I'm not going to do is discard God. But I feel daunted by all of this. I mean, if I raise the subject of there are absolute standards, and our world is being destroyed because we're abandoning those standards, people just think I'm a joke.
Yeah.
I mean, how does that person, the ordinary Christian, respond when they're being mocked like that?
Yeah, well, look, this is the second volume of Bertrand Russell's biography, right? Written by a man called Ray Monk, who's a professor of philosophy in Southampton, who's not writing as a Christian, doesn't show any Christian signs at all, who wrote because he's a philosopher. He loves Bertrand Russell. But as he works through his life, he comes to dislike him.
Okay. He says, as I've worked on this volume, says this man, two thoughts have dominated my reactions to him, which I am aware may have distorted my account of his life. The first is just how bad most of his writing on political, social and moral questions is. Few who know Russell from his great writings on logic have taken the trouble to read the vast quantity of journalism that he produced in the second half of his life. Those who do would, I think, be shocked at how sloppy and ill-considered it is. The second thought that's come to dominate my reaction to Russell, particularly in the latter half of his life, is how emotionally maimed he was. He was, it sometimes seems, simply incapable of loving another human being. I mean, that's pretty devastating, isn't it?
And that's from a fan.
Who wrote a book about it?
2 volumes, going through everything he wrote, all his letters.
Now, if you'd like to pass over the other 2 books, the ones that you wrote, because I want to mention those. I don't want people just to go away and read Bertrand Russell. The fastest 28 minutes on television is just about gone. These are good, thought-provoking books. If you want to get a copy of Prodigal World, which is the book that Phillip wrote, which analyses the way departing from God has damaged our world so seriously, or if you would like to read the other one, Pure Sex, the book that Phillip wrote together with Tony Payne, on where the ideas that distort our view of sexuality have come from and how the biblical view of sexuality actually works better, the place to go to is the publisher, and they've got a website, www.matthiasmedia.com.au. So www.matthiasmedia.com.au, and if you don't get it the first time, you just misspelled it. Try again in Google.
And it's good to do it on the web, because it's really hard to kind of walk into a bookshop and say, I want a book on pure sex.
Yes.
But from the website,
yes,
Matthias Media will send it to you.
A plain brown wrapper, please.
That's it.
So we need not to be intimidated as Christians,
Absolutely. Absolutely. The truth is with God. And although these very clever, and they are very clever people, they've got IQs that, run into 4 figures for all I know. Although these are very clever people,
yes,
at heart they're sinners.
Yep.
And they're using their cleverness
to justify sin.
Justify their sin.
So there you are. Even when having someone quoted to you who has got more degrees than a thermometer, don't be impressed. The Bible knows more truth than any intellectual does. Philip, thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
Thank you for your company on this edition of The Chat Room. We look forward to your company again next time.